right, good morning. We're in Hebrews chapter 2. We'll be looking at verses 14 to 18 again. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For indeed he does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. Therefore in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. Today's lesson is entitled Jesus, the Merciful and Faithful High Priest, and that comes from verse 17. So in that verse, the writer of the epistle for the first time refers to Jesus as the high priest. You might find this reference odd if you know what the Old Testament has to say about the high priest. The high priest, of course, was the priest in charge of all the other priests. All of the priests of Israel were descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses. But not just any priest could become the high priest. The high priesthood was inherited. That's what you want in that first blank. The high priesthood was inherited. Just as kings usually passed the kingship to their oldest surviving sons, so too the office of the high priest was passed on to the oldest surviving son of the last high priest. Referring to Jesus as the high priest is odd for two reasons. First, if the epistle was written before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, like we talked about when we started Hebrews, then a high priest was still serving at the temple. Second, all of the priests, including the high priest, were descendants of Aaron, meaning that they came from the tribe of Levi. Jesus, however, is not a descendant of Aaron, and he came from the tribe of Judah. The writer himself will note this fact in Hebrews 7, verses 11 to 16. You can look at that later. But he's going to note that Jesus didn't come from Levi, he came from Judah. The writer will go on to argue that the fact that Jesus came from the tribe of Judah and not Levi means that there has been a change in the priesthood. Jesus can be called the high priest, even though he is not a descendant of Aaron, because he is the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, and not according to the order of Aaron. Just as the new covenant has replaced the old covenant, so too the order of Melchizedek has replaced the order of Aaron. We will discuss this more when we get to those passages in Hebrews. Even so, even though Jesus is the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, the writer points out more than once that Jesus shares many similarities with the high priests of the Old Testament, because what the high priest did for Israel, Jesus does for the believers, the church. Today I would like to focus on this concept. I would like to look at the functions and expectations of the Old Testament high priest and see how they are similar to what Jesus does today. In doing so, I will bring in scriptures not only from Hebrews, but also from other parts of the New Testament as well. Aaron, of course, was the first high priest. What is interesting is that he is never referred to as the high priest. He is quite often referred to as simply the priest. You'll see that many times in the Old Testament. Aaron the priest. Aaron the priest. Some of the laws, especially in Deuteronomy, prescribe what the priest is supposed to do, and these functions would almost certainly have been performed by the high priest. The title, the high priest, appears in the law only in Leviticus 21, and again in the law concerning the cities of refuge in Numbers 35. We will get to those passages in a few minutes. The functions of the high priest included, number one, offering sacrifices. Offering sacrifices. This was his primary function. He offered up sacrifices on behalf of the people of Israel, mainly to atone for their sins. So many sacrifices had to be made that the other priests helped him. 1 Chronicles 6:9 summarizes the work of the high priests and the other priests. Aaron and his sons offered sacrifices on the altar of burnt offering and on the altar of incense for all the work of the most holy place and to make atonement for Israel, according to all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. The most important sacrifice was made on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would enter the most holy place, also known as the Holy of Holies, and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat to atone for the sins of all of Israel. Jesus also made a sacrifice, himself, to atone for our sins. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood of another. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. That's Hebrews 9:24-28. Jesus therefore offered a sacrifice to atone for sins, just as the high priest did. Number 2, teaching the law. That is, the high priest, he was supposed to teach them the word of God, the truth. Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may distinguish between the holy and unholy, and between the unclean and clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses." Leviticus 10:8-11. Jesus was known as the teacher. In fact, he calls himself a teacher in Matthew 23, verses 8-10, and John 13:13. He taught us what was holy and what was not holy. He taught us what the statutes of the Lord really meant, and he taught us the truth so that we could recognize lies when we heard them. Jesus therefore taught the word of God just as the high priest did. Number 3, being a judge. Being a judge. During the Exodus, Moses set up a series of judges who handled the majority of cases so that only the more difficult cases came to him. The same series of judges was set up in Israel so that only the difficult cases came to the priests, including the high priest. That's in Deuteronomy 17, verses 8-13. Let me turn there. If a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge, between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them. They shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. You shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in that place which the Lord chooses. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they order you, according to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you, according to the judgment which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left from the sentence which they pronounce upon you. Now the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die. So you shall put away the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear and no longer act presumptuously. This law says that the priests, plural, along with the judge, would pass judgment. But it ends by saying that if a man acts presumptuously and disobeys the priest, singular, meaning the high priest and the judge, then that man should be executed. Jesus has been appointed by the Father to be the judge of mankind. That's in John 5:22-30. And there Jesus says, "For the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life. Most assuredly I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment. Also, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. I can of myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me." Jesus gets to pass judgment on every person, and his judgment will stand. Anyone who has done evil, that is, anyone who has acted presumptuously by continually disobeying him, will be executed by spending eternity in the lake of fire, the resurrection and condemnation. Jesus, therefore, will be a judge just as the high priest was. So those are the functions of the high priest. He had to offer sacrifices, teach the law, and be a judge. The high priest also had to meet certain expectations. Number one, the high priest had to marry a virgin. Had to marry a virgin. Leviticus 21, 1-9 gives the expectations of the priests. They could not touch a dead body unless the person was a member of his immediate family. They also could not marry a divorcee or an immoral woman, but they are not specifically told that they could not marry a widow. Leviticus 21, 10-15 then gives the expectations of the high priest, and this passage is the first one in the Bible to use that title. This is because God wanted to distinguish the high priest from the other priests. The high priest was held to a higher standard than the other priests. He could not touch any dead body, not even if the person was a member of his immediate family. And he is specifically told that he must marry a virgin. He cannot marry a divorcee or an immoral woman or a widow. In other words, he must marry a woman who is pure and spotless. Jesus one day will marry the church. But before he does so, he will make sure she is pure and spotless on her wedding day by cleansing her from all of her sins, as Ephesians 5:25-27 says. There it says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish." It was also Paul's desire to see that the church is pure and spotless on her wedding day. To the Corinthians he said, "For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy. For I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ." 2 Corinthians 11:2. Therefore, Jesus will marry a virgin just as the high priest did. That virgin, of course, being the church. Number two, the high priest had to be physically perfect. Going back to Leviticus 21. Leviticus 21:16-24 says that any priest, which would include the high priest, who had any sort of physical blemish, could not offer the sacrifices. This is what it actually says here. And the Lord said to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron, saying, no man of your descendants in succeeding generations who has any defect may approach to offer the bread of his God. For any man who has a defect shall not approach, a man blind or lame, who has a marred face or any limb too long, a man who has a broken foot or broken hand, or is a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man who has a defect in his eye, or eczema or scab, or is a eunuch. No man of the descendants of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall come near to offer the offerings made by fire to the Lord. He has a defect. He shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He may eat the bread of his God, both the most holy and the holy, only he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar, because he has a defect, lest he profane my sanctuaries, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. And Moses told it to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel. The priests, including the high priest, had to be physically perfect. Now listen to what Leviticus 22:18-25 says about the sacrifices themselves. Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, whatever man of the house of Israel or of the strangers in Israel who offers his sacrifice for any of his vows or for any of his free will offerings, which they offer to the Lord as a burnt offering, you shall offer of your own free will a male without blemish from the cattle, from the sheep, or from the goats. Whatever has a defect you shall not offer, for it shall not be acceptable on your behalf. And whoever offers the sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord to fulfill his vow, or a free will offering from the cattle or the sheep, it must be perfect to be accepted. There shall be no defect in it. Those that are blind or broken or maimed or have an ulcer or eczema or scabs, you shall not offer to the Lord, nor make an offering by fire of them on the altar of the Lord. Either a bull or a lamb that has any limb too long or too short, you may offer as a free will offering, but for a vow it shall not be accepted. You shall not offer to the Lord what is bruised or crushed or torn or cut. You shall make any offering of them, nor shall you make any offering of them in your land. Nor from a foreigner's hand shall you offer any of these as the bread of your God, because their corruption is in them and defects are in them. They shall not be accepted on your behalf. The language God used to describe the blemished priests, he also uses to describe the blemished sacrifices. The sacrifices had to be as physically perfect as the priests were. Now, in the Old Testament, God used the physical to help us to see the spiritual. Jesus did not have to be physically perfect to make his sacrifice, but he did have to be spiritually perfect. And his sacrifice did not have to be physically perfect, but it did have to be spiritually perfect. That is why Jesus had to be sinless. He was both the perfect priest and the perfect sacrifice. He was the perfect priest who offered the perfect sacrifice himself. The Bible tells us that we are expected to do the same. Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2:9 that we are a royal priesthood. And John tells us in Revelation 1:6 that Christ has made us both kings and priests. As priests, we are expected to offer up a sacrifice. What is that sacrifice? Ourselves. Paul says in Romans 12:1, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. We are expected to be perfect priests who offer up the perfect sacrifice, ourselves. Do we do this perfectly? Of course not. But that is the standard. That's the goal. Those are some of the expectations of the high priest. He had to marry a virgin and be physically perfect. I mentioned that Leviticus 21 is the first passage in the Bible to use the title the high priest. The title appears again in the law, only in the law concerning the cities of refuge. The cities of refuge in Numbers 35. Once Israel conquered the Promised Land, each tribe was given its own territory. However, the tribe of Levi, which included the priests, was not given its own territory. Instead, God told Moses to give 48 cities scattered throughout Israel to the Levites. 6 of those cities were also designated as the cities of refuge. 3 of them were on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and 3 of them were on the western side. In the Old Testament days, if you killed someone, whether purposefully or accidentally, a relative of the deceased had the right to kill you. This relative was called the avenger of blood. However, if you accidentally killed someone, you could flee to a city of refuge, and once you got inside, the avenger of blood could not touch you. You still had to stand trial to see if you, in fact, did kill accidentally. If the congregation decided in your favor, you could remain in the city of refuge. However, if you left the city of refuge, the avenger of blood could kill you. The avenger, therefore, had the power of death, and if you feared death, if you did not want to die, you stayed in the city of refuge. But this meant that you actually lived in bondage. Yes, the city of refuge protected you from the avenger, but the city was also your prison. You could not go home and see your family. You could not go back and work in your own fields. You could not go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the feasts. This fear of death kept you in bondage, and it kept you there until the day you died. There was only one way out of the city of refuge. You could go free, and the avenger could not harm you if the high priest died before you did. The death of the high priest set you free from your bondage. Jesus did the same for us. Before we became Christians, because we feared death, we were subject to bondage. And Satan, because he constantly seeks to kill and destroy, would have loved to have killed us then and there. But Jesus provided a refuge for us and protected us from the devil until we came to see that the death of Jesus Christ, our high priest, paid for our sins and set us free from that bondage. We no longer need to fear the devil and death. The writer of the epistle tells us that there is one more way in which Jesus is similar to the high priest of the Old Testament. One of the advantages of the high priests of the Old Testament is that every one of them was human. Probably an obvious fact, but it's one of the advantages, that they were actually human. They faced the same struggles which we face. They had to deal with the loss of loved ones, with the anxiety of not knowing what to do next, with people who did not love them and even criticized them mercilessly, with sickness, with power, with money problems, with temptations, and yes, with sin. For they too, just like us, sinned. That is why on the Day of Atonement, before the high priest could enter the most holy place and make atonement for all of Israel, he had to make a sacrifice to atone for his own sin. That's Leviticus 16, 6 and 11. The high priest, therefore, could understand our weaknesses. He could sympathize with us. He could understand us. The writer of the epistle tells us that Jesus, our high priest, took on human flesh and became a man so that he too could sympathize with us, just like the other high priests did. That's in Hebrews chapter 4, starting at verse 14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. And no man takes his honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. And that's Hebrews 4:14 to 5:4. Because Jesus chose to live in a body of flesh like we do, because he suffered like we suffer, because he faced the same challenges like we face, because he was tempted like we are, he understands our weaknesses. He can sympathize with us, he can understand us, and he can help us. He is like us in every way except for sin. This is why, going back to Hebrews 2:17, Jesus had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. Because he is a merciful high priest, he knows that we need his help. And because he is a faithful high priest, we know that he will indeed help us. And that's what I have for today. So let's take a little break, and then before we actually get into any questions and answers, Sue has something that she wants to share with us.